Hello everyone. We've already talked about kind of the basics of our code. So we looked at these codes and we've seen it in terms of the WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. Format that Visual Studio puts it in. Now let's go ahead and talk about what I'm going to refer to as events and event handlers. Basically an event is and actually, let's write this down somewhere. Let's define events. So, an event, as you can see, is an action that may force a trigger, and the event handling is going to create this response from them. And obviously, they go hand in hand, right? What triggers that event, or what action occurs, has to come through an input, which we're going to call essentially just hardware, whether it's a keyboard, mouse click, a controller, anything out there that can talk to our computer and run stuff through the CPU. So the first question is that can you have an event without an event handler? And the answer is yes. So if I were to look through here, I have an exit B button, a big C button, a label 1 button, and a button 1, and a click me. And those, if you look at them, they all say click next to them because that means a left mouse click will activate them. But what you don't see is a button 2 method, right? Because there is no event handler to hold it. So if I were to start this, and I click the don't click me, the event is me just pushing on that button. The event handler then allows it to do a response. But if I click on button 2, nothing happens. So I have that event, I have that input, but I have no handling of that event. All it does is nothing. In this case, it's kind of nice because as an up and a down state that you can that is inherent to Visual Studio, that it puts it in there for you, so at least you know you're doing something, but there is no response to what we're doing other than the visual. So let's take a look now at some of this language that we see, and what I will always say is if you want to get there the quickest, so if you want to see what this button does the quickest, you can open up the code, but the easiest way is to just double click into here. So in here, our handling or our response is doing this. It's going to create a message box, and as you can see, message box is gray, so that is known, that's a keyword known to Visual Studio and C#. What that does is create, guess what, a message box, right? It's similar to a dialog box, except you can't put anything in it, and then you have to show it. So just because you've created it doesn't mean it's going to appear. The next you say, okay, make it show, and inside it put you click me, and look very closely, those are double quotes, you have to have those around. This is what's referred to as a string literal. So it is going to come out as you clicked me. Now, is there such a thing as a string illiteral? Well, I don't know if they actually call it that, but if it's not literal, that means it's a variable that can change. So in other words, if you do a message box show and say word, and that word doesn't have quotes around it, that means word can be any word that you pick, or series of words. You'll also notice that this is a long line. It's not numbers. It's not whatever. This has to be what's referred to as a string. And string is kind of short for string of characters. So that means if you just were to try to put in, and I'll do this really quickly, put in the term 120 and try to start it, it's not going to like that. Because 120 is a number and not characters. Characters are pretty much anything you can type on your keyboard. But if I put in the quotes around it, then all of a sudden it doesn't see it as a number, it sees it as a string or set of words or set of letters. whatever you want, whatever way makes you understand this better. And if I do it now and hit start and click the Don't Click Me button, I get 120. Now the other thing you'll see here is label1.text. Now I left this as label 1, which is really bad programming. You should usually rename this whenever you do it. So in other words, if I were to click right here, you'd see the word uno, right? Well, uno comes from this property box where I actually put in the word uno. And it's essentially a placeholder. So when I start it up, you should be able to see uno, plain and simple. I can't click into it. It's actually officially a label. So the way I grabbed it was I took it and I put it here, and there is the label. Now in this case, that was label 1. This is label 2. Now what I'd like you to do in this case is say, you can leave it as label 2 as the text, but what I want you to get in the habit of doing is renaming this into, I'm going to call it unused, and then label. Or label unused, whatever you want to call it. Now, a lot of times that's what I'll do. I like to do the label unused, just so I immediately know what it is. Because you're going to have a lot of variables in your program, and the easier you can make it on yourself when you go back to try to figure out what's what, the better. So if I say label unused, I know it's a label and I know I never use it. If that makes sense. If I were to say this is the title, why don't we call it label title? And then let's move it up here. Let's not call it label 2. We'll call it instead dysfunctional app. And now we have a nice little dysfunctional app at the top. I can change the font. As you can see right here, there's a little font piece in the properties. I can change that, make it a little bigger, maybe make it 14. And now it's a little bit bigger. If I move it left to right, as you can see, I can center it about a whole bunch of things. As it turns out, this looks a little bit crowded, so I'm going to loosen it up. I don't want to make this look too good because it's a first app, and we'll worry more about making things better and better looking later. For right now, we're just learning the basics. So now we have a nice label, and labels can be used and double clicked upon, but in this case, all these things are going to be done is not updated. Now the last thing I'll talk about for now is I'm using something that's called Camel Casing. And Camel Casing means that if you have a variable and you want to name it something and it's made up of 2 words, 2 distinct words, or 3 or 4 or whatever, what you do is, in the case, since it's just a normal variable and not a class name, not a namespace, whatever, you're going to make that whole first word all lowercase. Then to distinguish the second word, we're going to make the T in title capital or uppercase. And then if I were to make it even longer, label title for app, something like that, as you can see, each one of the first letters of those words is going to get a capital letter. So, you know, kind of like the bumps on a camel. And so we'll just allow for that. And then when we look into our program, I'm going to note a bunch of things now looking at this. So first off, it's a label because I called it a label. Second off, since the L is small, that means it's not a method or a namespace. If you noticed on the past videos, I'm going to go into Form 1, that I go to the error list, I get these messages that the naming rule violation. These words must begin with an uppercase character. So my click me, it doesn't like because it's a method. If it were just a standard variable like label 1, it has no problem with that. But because it's a method, it says the natural convention is to put the capital in the beginning. So that distinguishes method names, class names, form 1, and namespaces. Now, namespaces get a little bit of a break because they suck the name straight from the solution file name, so you can allow this, but there's some people who would say don't do that either. Make sure that's capital. Okay, so those are just some basic practices that you should get used to, and this is poor etiquette, we'll call it, to use that. But now let's get back to it. So we know this is a label. We know it's label 1. We can find label 1. Oops, I think I accidentally clicked it twice. Label 1 starts off as uno, and when I click that button, it's going to change it to 4 zeros. This has to be there. Even though it's a label, even though it's text, you have to say, okay, I'm taking text and putting it into the label. So that's what that dot text means. So in other words, remember what I said about the quotes. Even though that's a number inside it, because it's a set of quotes around it, it thinks of those 4 zeros as 4 characters on your keyboard. So the character right by the 9 on your keyboard or right below the 1 on your numpad, it says we're putting 4 of those, again, in a literal fashion, straight to the keyboard, so that when I push, don't click me, you'll see OK. And notice it hasn't changed at first, because what we're doing here is sequential. It's going to hit the message box show first. We're going to have to hit the OK to the message box before it can go to the next line. That's the difference between sequential and simultaneous. If it was simultaneous, both of these executable lines would happen at the same time, but it's not. For this case, it's going to do it in sequential fashion. Now, in terms of the buttons, I can click any one of these buttons at the same time. So all those events and event handlers are listening as we speak, or not as we speak, because we're in the dialog box. Excuse me, the message box. But once we get out of the message box, those will simultaneously listen. All 4 of those buttons will simultaneously listen until one of them's clicked. So let's go ahead and click OK here, and then we'll see the update. If we run through this, you'll see a lot of other things that don't run anything. So now the button 1 click doesn't do anything. The label 1 click doesn't do anything. The reason why there's a label 1 click in here is probably at some point I double clicked into it and it automatically created that method saying you want to put something in it, you want to make this do something in it. But the point from that, you don't need to create a button in order to create an event. So buttons tend to naturally allow themselves to be events. It isn't necessary for them to be events. So let's go ahead and run this so you get an idea. When I click on this, what I'm calling the big C, and actually let's take a look at this for a second. And as you can see under the properties, its name is Big C. It has placements, it has an image, and it also, if I double click on it, it goes to a function, meaning that it can update our interface, or our GUI interface. So when I push play on here, and then I click on the big C, it says it tells me I click the big C, okay. because that's just like the other message box. But now it's going to update the label instead of all zeros, 033, which as you can see does it right there. So we can use these images or these picture boxes as buttons themselves. In fact, we can use labels as buttons themselves. So I'm going to get out of this for a second. I'm going to go back to that click here, and you will see right here the word picture box. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means we can create a picture box from our toolbox. So let's move our C over just a little bit, and let's bring in another picture box. As you can see in the toolbox under P, picture box, click and drag that guy in here. And it'll come out as a nice rectangle, but that rectangle can be resized to whatever you want. Now, as you can see also is that it's blank. There's nothing in there. So all it is really a frame. It's no picture box. And to change that, what we can do is come over to the properties of that picture box. And we're going to go to background image and double click it. Or single click it. And when you single click it, you're going to get this ... box. If you click on that, it'll allow you to select a picture. The project resource files is something that you can build up, and we'll do that more later. But right now we're just going to bring in one object from somewhere on our PC. And I'm going to grab this guy. Simple bitmap, and it can do bitmaps, can do JPEGs, can do GIFs, can do pings. It has a very wide capability of it. And when we do that, it's going to show us a little bit of it here, and I'm going to say OK. And then when you look at it, not that pretty. Now, why is that? Because the bitmap was big, and so it's really just showing the top left corner of the bitmap. In order to get that correctly, we got to change it to a different layout. This background image layout is in tile form, and tile is just like a bathroom tile. It's meant to put it over and over and over in this kind of grid-like fashion. We don't want to do that. So let's try another one. Let's do center. Well, look at that. Didn't do much, because really now what it tries to center this object, but it's still too big. So we're still getting the top left corner of it. So what we have to do is go to stretch, or do we? This looks good, but the problem with the stretch is that as you move and resize this picture box, it stretches the image inside, which can be good because it can fit it exactly. But if you remember that picture from initially, it was essentially a square with a little notch out of the bottom. I shouldn't say square, a cube. So what we want to do is get it back to this cube. So we either have to fiddle with it till it looks like it's a cube, or we don't have to guess. We can go to the zoom and it'll put it in the proper format. So here it cannot be stretched vertically like it was before. But the issue here is we're forced with the dimensions or the aspect ratio of that bitmap. And as you can see, it's very wide and not necessarily long. It actually looks almost like a full screen type of 16 by 9 kind of fit. So I can reset the picture box to kind of set that, or kind of make that correct, and then put it in there. And to kind of create the picture itself, or excuse me, not the picture, a button out of it, all I have to do is double click into it. Because look here, we got a picture one box. Probably should have renamed it something else, but that works. We're okay. And it's now a clickable item. So let's think for a second what we can do with it. Well, why don't we update the label again? That's nice and simple. And just to prove to you that I can do something other than numbers, let's type in hello. And we can play with other pieces of information. So in other words, when I look at this guy, he's fully visible and the big C exists, right? Well, if you go to the properties again, and now let's hit this button where it does an alphabetical order, because I know what I'm looking for. I know exactly what property I'm looking for. It has a visible property set to true. Let's play with that a little bit. Because this word is visible, that is directly associated with big C. And if I double click onto this, I can say big C, and notice I can, I know if I tab through, I know I get the right one. I'm going to type in visible. And the nice thing about the auto completion here is that I'm tempted to, depending on software language, sometimes visible is big uppercase V, sometimes it's not. In this case, I started typing in V. If I hit tab, it'll automatically update it to the proper word visible that's specific to C#. And then I'm going to say false. And let it turn to blue. Now let's see what happens when we do that. So now I'm going to click it, and the C goes away. But the problem with this is when that C goes away, I can't grab it. It's no longer a button. Visible not only means turning the visibility off, it's actually turning the interactivity, the event handler off as well. So I can't click and update my label with that anymore. So if you do something like that, I always suggest putting an out to it. So if I have big C visible here, I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to put this somewhere else, maybe in the click me button that we know works, and then set it equal to true, because that will turn it back on. So if I hit start, hit this button, which is now technically not a button, but it's a picture button that acts as a button, and then hit the don't click me, there you go. All of a sudden the C is back and we are in good shape. Okay, let me reset these for a second and kind of clean this up. There. The basic lesson from this then is that there are lots of properties here that we can update. We can update via the button themselves, and we can go through the code. And more importantly, if you see a word like back color, guess what? You're going to connect the button name, in this case picture box 1, dot back color becomes a significant property than one that you can change and update. And all these guys are game. All these guys are game here. Feel free to look through them and play with that a little bit on your own. Now, as you noticed, or hopefully you noticed, as I've been doing this program, I've been testing it out every time I did it. So I do an update, I run it, I push the button, is it working correctly? That's what I'm going to call stepwise refinement. You're taking it and breaking the program into smaller pieces and constantly updating those pieces to find the errors. Now, what's the advantage of this? Well, when you write a whole program, and let's say you write a 500-line program, and you just do it all at once. When you click that start button, you might end up having 35 errors, and you go in there and you'll spend like an hour and a half trying to get those 35 errors out, and after you're done fixing those 35 errors, they create 20 new errors, and then you go in there and then you do 5 new errors. And so you just kind of have this thing where you have error upon error upon error, and you're trying to fix everything out all at once. When you use the stepwise refinement piece and you're kind of testing this as it goes, then you can find that error, spend less time trying to fix it and find it, and then you can create a kind of a smoother app process and a smoother app in terms of execution as well. All right, so the last piece that I'm going to show you is my exit. I have one exit button. Now, as you probably noticed, whenever we create an app, we always have the little X button. And sometimes you might suppress this top border. So let's say you put something on a mobile device. You're not going to necessarily want that. You might want this gray area to take up the whole space. So in that case, you might actually want an exit button. There's other times when you want an exit button as well. The simplest way to create it is, well, first off, I call it exit B for exit button. I don't know if I call it that, but at least it demonstrates what it's going to do. And when I double click into it, maybe I should have put a big E on it, because ultimately this is going to be the name of the method, exit B click, so that if I had put a big E on there, I would have automatically had a correct method name as well. But let's go into it anyways. All that I'm doing is putting the word this.close. Well, close does exactly what you think it does. It closes whatever it's attached to, and this period is essentially an attachment point. Close is going to be its own method that has already been created somewhere else in the library. So it goes through a series of executable lines. Now, what are those lines? You don't have to worry about them. What you do have to worry about is what it is closing. And in this time, we're using the word this. And the simplest way that I can put the term this for, and as you can see, it's a keyword, it is whatever form that you're operating on in the current conditions. So right now we're used to only seeing one form. This is only one form, right? But what happens if I had a button that opened another form, and then another form, and then another form? Or maybe when I open this up, I open up 10 forms that fit the entire shape of my monitor. You can do that in C# in Visual Studio. This refers to the one that's active. So in other words, when I click on this, notice how it's a specific color. Let's say I'm going to try something else. Let me bring a PowerPoint in. I click on this, it turns a color, and this one fades out, right? That means that this refers to just this form. It's nice because it's going to just close something without thinking about it. Okay, whatever's active, close it. I don't actually have to name the form 1. That just takes a lot of the complexity out of it, and we can close this specific form at this time. Okay, let's put a bow on this. I think we did a good job here, and we'll continue next time with a little bit more programming on our actual forms.